started.
Writing about the bird.
Okay, we can share the.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the folks at the table, if you're on mute, maybe turn your sound back on. All right, welcome everybody to our Lunch and Learn event focusing on community engaged research, and thank you for being in person today. And shout out to the folks watching online through Convergence Magazine and folks across the country. I am Dr. Kim Tabardi, the External Affairs, I almost said Executive Director, the External Affairs Director at USC Equity Research Institute. I'd like to recognize that California is home to Native nations on whose land we are living, and acknowledge that USC is located on Tongva land. We also honor the legacy of the African diaspora and recognize that this country would not exist without the free enslaved labor of Black people. We share these acknowledgements to 1, pay respect to the original caretakers of this land, 2, to raise awareness about histories that are too often erased or forgotten, and 3, to recognize our place in history and affirm our own commitment to social change. So if you can just pause for a second, feel the ground underneath your feet, and honor the land. Thank you. While we recognize the historical theft of land and labor, this must not be a performance. We must move forward towards repair. What does that look like for you as an individual, and how does that extend to the institutions you serve? So thank you again for acknowledging the Native folks and our ancestors. So I will introduce our lovely panel and then turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Rishi. Our first panelist is Dr. Teresa Gonzalez. We'll give a wave so folks know who you are there. All right.
Hi, friends.
A native of Mexican Chicago. Born and raised in the Pilsen community. Did I say that right?
Yep.
Yeah. She's an urban sociologist who firmly believes in the capacity of sociology to redress social injustices and inequalities. As a feminist and a woman of color urbanist, she is rooted in community-engaged pedagogy and scholarship, and strive towards a practice of reciprocity in research as an assistant professor of sociology at Loyola University, Chicago. Her latest book is Building a Better Chicago, Race and Community Resistance to Urban Redevelopment. She might hold it up on her phone there.
Oh yeah, I'll do that later because I forgot.
Our second speaker is Sabrina Smith. Wave, Sabrina. Organizing Director and Strategic Comms Director at SCOPE, which stands for Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Policy Education.
That was a former life.
For 10 years ago, and she was there. She was also a field director for past LA Mayor Villaraigosa. We won't talk about that. And currently leads the work as the CEO at California Calls. Longtime ERI tribe member and an amazing organizer. Sabrina, welcome, Sabrina.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Dr. Cedric de Leon, Professor of Sociology and Labor Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Cedric has published 5 books in his work, and his newest book, actually, wait, I'll hold off on the title to end. He writes on race, labor, and party politics, and teaches courses in social theory, political sociology, organizing, and US labor history. He serves as the director of the UMass Amherst Labor Center for 7 years. Prior to being in academics, he was an elected leader and a staff organizer in the US labor movement. Hopefully we'll hear more about from him today about his latest book, Freedom Train, Black Politics and the Story of Interracial Labor Solidarity. Holding it up, nice. And our final speaker panelist is Maurice Mitchell, a nationally recognized social movement strategist, a visionary leader in the movement for Black lives, a community organizer for racial, social, and economic justice. A Howard University grad, he became active after a classmate was killed by police officers, leading organizing efforts against police brutality and divestment from private prisons. He also worked as an organizer for Long Island Progressive Coalition, organizing director for Citizen Action of New York, and director of New York State Civic Engagement Table. After Mike Brown was killed by the police in Missouri, Maurice relocated to Ferguson to support organizations on the ground. Seeing the need for an anchor organization to provide strategic support and guidance to the movement for Black Lives activists across the country, he co-founded and managed Blackbird, and in 2018, he took the helm at the Working Families Party as the national director. You wave already? People know who I'm talking about? Okay. And our moderator today is Dr. Rishi Awatramani, our current ERI Turpanjian postdoc scholar, hailing from Johns Hopkins University with a doctorate in sociology. His research examines the racial politics of the working class and historical patterns of social protests globally and in the US. His research agenda takes shape through the study of the historically specific structures and conditions which shape the racial politics of urban working class neighborhoods. And I'm sorry, I don't know why I don't have my glasses as I'm doing this, but forgive me for stumbling through words. It's because I can the words are moving. Focusing especially on transformation in the structures of capital accumulation, neighborhood level civic society, and city and national level development policies. He offers new conceptual tools for analyzing the conditions under which the appeals of social movements achieve salience. All of his work is motivated by his prior career as a community and labor organizer in US social movements. Give it up for this panel. All right, I will now turn it over to Dr. Rishi for opening remarks, and you can stay there if you like.
All right, thank you so much, Kim, and thank you so much to everybody in this room. It's a real treat to have you all here, and shout out to the Convergence family watching online. So building a little bit off of what Kim has already put into the room, movements face particular kinds of dilemmas as they seek to build a sufficiently broad and popular response to the authoritarian and anti-democratic crisis unfolding before us. So I want to help frame the comments that the panelists will give shortly by just briefly touching on some of the dilemmas that they face to help us root the discussion we're about to have. As we all know, the authoritarian threat that we face today is painfully real and has been unfolding at a blistering pace since January. From the deepening price rise of staple household goods to the vast assault on immigrant families, from the gutting of government services and attacks on government workers to increasing militarization here in Gaza and around the world, wide swaths of society are feeling the immediate and day-to-day consequences of what we can call democratic authoritarianism, which is authoritarianism organized through both legal democratic and extra-legal means and supported by popular mobilization in at least some quarters. Communities, organizations, and individual households have all been called upon to respond, and respond they have. Political scientist Erica Chenoweth reminds us that there have been more protest events in the first 100 days of Trump's second term than during the resistance movement during Trump's first term. As important as it is to protest to disrupt the unfolding crisis, movements are keenly aware that more is required to defeat the authoritarian turn. Now, in other parts of the world, and indeed in other times in US history, movements have responded by organizing broad alliances or fronts of diverse groups from seemingly incompatible backgrounds, often across class, to challenge authoritarianism. With partisans of the authoritarian trend now having successfully achieved a power grab over much of the US state, many movement organizations are sharpening their strategic clarity that building a broad front of the anti-MAGA majority is essential to isolate the authoritarian right. Movements nonetheless face critical dilemmas in pursuing this strategy. Careful attention to the front building efforts in history reveals that these dilemmas may not be new, even if the context in which they're emerging now is very new. First, social movements must attend to the needs and exigencies of their typically working class social base while building ties to other social groups across class to organize a viable opposition capable of challenging authoritarianism. Now, this kind of careful attention can be seen in the context of the 1930s Popular Front and New Deal era, which linked militant working class politics to radical middle class intellectuals, lawyers, and artists in seeding a popular mass left culture that strengthened the social democratic reforms of the New Deal. Second, movements must confront the dilemma of maintaining independence while facing pressure to submit to the leadership of more powerful organizations with whom they must partner to challenge the authoritarian threat. Here, according to at least some scholars, Popular Front reformers fared less well, conceding independence and autonomy to the elites in their coalition, paving the way for the anti-left and anti-communist hysteria that would take hold following the Second World War. Third, are broad fronts to be organized as formally constituted organizations or as informal networks? And what challenges await organizers on either path? Another broad coalitional effort in US history exemplifies this dilemma. We'll look at the Rainbow Coalition, organized around Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns in the 1980s, which was eventually organized as a formal network as it sought to marshal the incredible virility of the Black movement and other progressive sectors in the era of Reagan and the onset of US neoliberalism. But the Rainbow Coalition was hopelessly tied to the individual charisma and leadership of Jackson, who ultimately oversaw the coalition's implosion after the failure of his candidacies to win the nomination in the Democratic Party. So these are among the questions we hope to discuss in our panel and conversation today, either through the panelists' remarks or in discussion and Q&A to follow. As a tentative set of claims that address some of these dilemmas without answering them fully, I offer the following guideposts. First, broad fronts must function as majoritarian alliances or coalitions designed to unite all those opposed to authoritarians in order to isolate those authoritarians. Two, the front must establish the non-negotiable position of opposing authoritarianism while being flexible about other aspects of its platform. Three, progressives must struggle inside the front to offer a bold alternative vision and plan for ambitious social change without losing sight of the front's breadth and core purpose. And four, movements must position themselves as the most diehard force for maintaining the coherence of the front they are building and for instilling in it a radical notion of inclusivity and democracy. So with these comments in mind, I'm going to turn it over to our panel, and we're going to hear from Dr. Teresa Gonzalez first.
All right, perfect. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to meet you all and be in conversation. A huge thank you to Rishi and Kim and all of the other organizers. I know that this was not an easy thing to undertake, and so we really appreciate it. I'm going to be very brief because, you know, academics can talk a whole lot, and I want us to be in conversation sooner rather than later. As Kim mentioned, I come from Chicago, very proudly from Chicago. This is the home of the Haymarket protest, Jane Addams and the Hull House movement, Saul Alinsky, Fred Hampton's original Rainbow Coalition, right, which aimed to unite all poor people, white, Black, and brown, the Young Lords, and countless other community activists who have operated in formal, informal, and guerrilla-style organizations and movements. Much of what I've learned about activism and coalition building comes from African-American, Mexican-American, and Puerto Rican women. So if there's one thing that I hope we carry forward from this conversation, from the conversations we have from this weekend, is that we need to listen to and follow the leadership of these women and moving forward, right? Because they've been fighting these fights for a very long time and they know how to build coalitions. So in putting this together, Rishi asked us to consider what front building might look like as we organize against rising authoritarianism. And to echo what so many have already said, and I mean, not just in this room, right, but nationally, we must build coalitions across difference. Right, this includes with people who may only now be reckoning with their alignment to white Christian nationalism. Right, this isn't the time for exclusion or authenticity politics of who's woke enough, of who voted for who, of who said what. Right, we need everyone who is willing to do the work of fighting, and we need to invite them into that conversation. The other thing that we need to be reminded of, and I say this because these are also things I need to remind myself of, right? Is that not everyone is going to be as radicalized or as informed as we want them to be, or as we might expect them to be. The work then is to meet people where they're at while they're still engaging, right? And to introduce them to some of that political education, some of that skill building that may need to take place. If someone's moved, you know, by the cost of groceries, by the closure of VA hospitals, by the rollback of women's rights, that's a point of entry. Right? That's where we can start those conversations. And then if we can connect the dots from personal pain to systemic injustice, that should be a win in and of itself, to then keep that conversation moving. The other thing to keep in mind is that everyone has a role to play. I mean, I've just joined a Unitarian Universalist church. This is very new. I'm a atheist. And one of the women every single Sunday is like, we have to do something every single day, right? Get on the phone, do something small every single day. And she's right? We all have a role to play in that. Some of those folks are going to be protesting in the streets. They have the ability to do that, right? Not everybody has that ability. Others are going to work behind the scenes. We need all of it. And we especially need young people in the mix, because y'all have a lot more energy, right? You have creative ideas. Us older folks get a little tired, so we need everybody in it. And it's really not the time to be apolitical, right? Put our head in the sand or hope that somebody else is going to fix things, right? Nobody's coming to save us. We have to really sort this out on our own. The other thing that I would like us to keep in mind is that the goal isn't to defeat Trump, right? As we all know, this administration is a symptom. It's not the disease, right? This has been a disease that has been festering since jump with this country. The deeper issues of racism, classism, sexism, xenophobia, and white supremacy cut across party lines. And even as some communities have made some gains, we're seeing widening inequality, ongoing attacks on reproductive health, and relentless police violence against perceived immigrants and African-American, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. I've done a lot of work in both rural and urban areas, and poverty hits just as hard in white communities as it does in Black and Latinx ones, right? So our coalition has to make space for all poor and working class people, right? Because we're all being screwed over in multiple ways. So what can we achieve when we actually come together? And I'm just going to briefly talk about the work that I've done in Chicago. So there, Black organizers developed a land use tool that helped build Black wealth through home ownership. Mexican American activists in broad national coalition, including with folks from the Appalachian Mountains, forced the cleanup of a Superfund site, shut down polluting coal plants, and built a 26-acre park in the heart of an industrial zone. These victories all came from coalition and coalition building among grassroots, nonprofit actors, and oftentimes the state. These people didn't always agree or even like each other. Most of the time, they hated each other, right? When you got them in closed rooms, but they stayed issue focused and committed. And so then that's the work ahead, right? Building coalitions that fight for quality education, dignified labor, a livable wage, environmental justice, and real representation of the issues that are affecting all of us. And, right, going back to Sharon every Sunday, we don't have to do it all, but we have to do something, right? We know that we're living in dangerous times. We're faced with this every single day that we turn on that news. What we're facing is not politics as usual. It's a coordinated attempt to erase civil rights, concentrate power, and criminalize dissent. The threats are real, especially for women, queer and trans folks, people of color, immigrants, and the poor. And authoritarianism doesn't arrive all at once, right? We know this. It creeps in through those silences, distractions, and divisions. So we can't afford to be divided, and we can't afford to be passive. I just want to end by something that one of my really good friends, Eva Hageman, she's on the East Coast, has said to me a few times. Silence will not protect us, right? The only way out is through, and the only way through is together. We need coalition politics now. We can't wait. And we can't look for perfect unity, but rather principled alignment, shared struggle, strategic action. And if we want a future that's free, just, and livable for all of us, then we have to build it together, and we have to invite folks to the table that we may not necessarily want to. So thank you. I'm going to end there.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Teresa. We're going to hand it over to Sabrina.
Hi, everybody. So again, my name is Sabrina Smith. I'm the CEO of California Calls. We're an alliance of amazing grassroots groups across the state that have been working for the past 16 years to expand the electorate to win bold transformational change that low-income communities and communities of color need and deserve. I want to start with, I was just agitated by one of our partners in Los Angeles. I came from a meeting where we're actually been for 2 years building a Los Angeles United Front. And he said that I am too Debbie Downer. And so I want to offer and start with a reminder to us all that hope is a discipline. I am Gen X. I can totally channel my Furiosa, inner Furiosa, preparation for the Mad Max apocalypse. So I've got to check myself constantly on this. And Anthony Pippin, he describes, again, like the cycles of violence as kind of progress and backlash as a spiral. And so we have seen, right, again, progress, backlash, progress, and backlash. Recently, I was on a panel with Manuel Pastor, who said that, this is the last gasp of white supremacist, patriarchal forces who are really trying to cling to minority rule. And I've also heard folks say that, like, they've already lost the ball. And so I do believe that we have to hold on and believe that we will come out stronger, that another world is possible. And as we move through this, we will get closer to that world that we envision and deserve. There's also reason for hope. I began organizing in the 1900s. As the youngins say. And so this was a moment of backlash to the gains of the civil rights movement. Here in California, we saw a slew of right-wing attacks where they were really like perfecting and fine-tuning the strategy that they exported across the country. John Liss and I are old enough to remember when we printed precinct lists on dot matrix printers, right? And we communicated on beepers and fax machines. Do you guys know what those are? Right, so when I think about what we were up against and the resources we had back then in the 1990s, wasn't like earlier in the 1900s, we have so much more power, infrastructure, resources than we did decades ago. And so as a movement, the challenge is, how do we overcome fragmentation? How do we overcome being kind of stuck in our issue silos and work in a more coordinated way where we actually can aggregate our power more effectively for impact? The second theme that also builds off what Teresa said is that I feel like in this moment, we need to hold a spirit of curiosity and experimentation. There's stuff that we know, right? But there's also a lot that we don't know. And so interrogating what of our organizing models is working and what do we need to experiment or challenge. I truly believe that the answer to the path forward is one-to-one organizing. Organizing is the key, but we also need to disrupt the status quo practices that frankly are preventing us from scaling our power. But I also mentioned some of these. We're talking to ourselves. We have to get back to the fundamentals of organizing, where we meet people where they're at, where we listen, and we have to think about new methods and new strategies to engage in political education to make meaning of the world. We also need to have humility, rigor, and honesty about the power that we do have and the power that we don't have. At the LA United Front meeting, it was a kind of leadership core group. We spent an hour just opening up the books and being real about the size of our base and the power that we have. So that kind of honesty, getting away from the vanity metrics, and being real about where we're at and how do we build power together. We can't be canceling people who don't share our perfect analysis. We have to understand that people view the world, also many of us, in contradictory ways. And we have to center culture and people, not our organizational logos, and not necessarily our issues. And so, like, how do we experiment? How do we disrupt some of these practices? How do we really think about how we center people and stories in a way that's going to grow and expand our movement? And then the final thing I want to offer is just some lessons from our alliance building and our attempts at building United Fronts, just like as a starting point. When COVID came down, we attempted to build a statewide United Front that included community organizations, it included labor unions, advocates, academics. It was cross-sector, cross-issue. And I think it was challenging for us to move from analysis, and in some ways just like sharing analysis, not necessarily even a shared analysis, to then moving towards strategy and action. And so I do think that aligning on analysis and making sure that folks share analysis is incredibly important. But again, that includes power analysis. That has to include a strategy for how we build and scale power and defeat the authoritarian attack. And I also think that there's like false dichotomies or choices that we're being asked right now. So is it about democracy? Is it about economic populism? Is it about racial justice? Is it about immigration? I think that those are false choices, and that part of what we need to do is connect the dots. So for example, with the big, beautiful budget bill, it is about tax cuts for the rich. It is about completely changing the role of government and slashing our safety net. And it's also about funding this cruel deportation machine that's about ripping families apart and deporting millions of people. I was talking to some folks in Oakland yesterday who were working on housing. We were talking about the tax on Section 8 and how that's going to, again, have impact on many sectors of our economy if it's eliminated. And it's also tied to this right-wing assault on democratic cities and democratic governance, where if hundreds of thousands of people lose their homes, lose their Section 8, and fill the streets. The second lesson is around formal and informal. I think Rishi mentioned this in some of the questions. I feel like it's a hybrid of both, like in terms of the form, right? We've been talking a lot about, we launched it's a pretty united front. We launched We Are California as an attempt, an experiment to build a united front, to shape the narrative, to push for bold demands. We've been talking a lot about what's just enough movement infrastructure, right? So we do need clarity. And I think this was also a challenge with the United Front we're building with COVID. It's like you have to have clarity about decision-making. There has to be transparency. There has to be kind of clear rules of engagement, what you get. And you have to be nimble enough so that it doesn't create another layer of bureaucracy where we're sitting in meetings all the time, and allows folks to tap in and for us to both better coordinate as well as think about the collective fights that we throw down on. And then the final thing is that in this question around how do we stay true and not get co-opted by other forces, we do have to build a broad united front. We have to build the no front. Linda, I've heard others quote you saying that it's everybody from the Trump-hating generals to the street protesting anarchists. Is that right? So we need that broad no front, but we also need to be aligned as progressives. And I think that's a critical piece in terms of creating a center of gravity that can continue to hold our feet to the fire, the center forces feet to the fire, so that we don't lose track of the structural change, the vision and values that are needed. And so that organizing in terms of that center of gravity is also a critical piece of our United Front strategy. And with that, I will end.
Thank you so much. I want to bring in Dr. De Leon.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So many thanks to Rishi and Kim for their leadership in organizing this event. To my fellow panelists who I am so inspired by, to all of you for coming, and to all the workers who made this conversation possible. The talk I'm going to give today is called The United Front. The inaugural meeting of the National Negro Congress began on a freezing February day in 1936. 800 delegates from 28 states converged on the 8th Regiment Armory in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. The delegates came from across the ideological spectrum. Speaking for the left were Harlem Communist Party head James Ford and Howard University professor Ralph Bunche. The Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. spoke on behalf of the Black clergy. Lester Granger promoted the National Urban League's plan for labor education among Black workers. So star-studded was the lineup that one delegate said, "I have never seen so many big shots together in my life." nor was this lost on the city's Black residents. Those who could not fit inside the armory huddled in their thousands around outdoor loudspeakers to hear what their leaders had to say. A. Philip Randolph, the country's leading Black trade unionist and head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, was determined to provide organizational direction to the Congress as its first president. He gave credit to previous attempts at Black unification, while simultaneously suggesting that the times called for a new approach. He said that although the fight for civil and political liberties had been brilliantly waged by the NAACP and the Communist International Labor Defense, quote, the gravity and complexity of the problem, accentuated and widened by the evil of fascist trends in America, demands that new tactics and strategy be employed to meet the situation. The maneuvering and disposing of the forces of Negro peoples against their enemies can only be effectively worked out through the tactics and strategy of the United Front. Moreover, Randolph insisted that Black people must lead the United Front. In this, he argued for a break with the Black middle class, who had grown accustomed to leaning on enlightened whites for support, and in doing so failed to challenge the system of white supremacy. He said, quote, the Negro people should not place their problems for solution down at the feet of their white sympathetic allies, which has been and is the common fashion of the old school Negro leadership. For in the final analysis, the salvation of the Negro, like the workers, must come from within. After several such speeches, the Congress voted on and passed a series of resolutions that underlined the meeting's focus on organizing the Black working class. These resolutions provide evidence that the delegates intended to establish a mass organization that could press for interracial solidarity in the wider labor movement. Noting that discrimination is practiced against Black workers in the trade unions, thus compelling these workers to remain unorganized and work for lower standards. The Congress resolved to establish labor committees for the special purpose of organizing the unorganized, as well as a governing trade union committee to direct the process. The combined infrastructure would be part of a nationwide drive with a focus on key industries in which Black people predominated. The delegates also emphasized the role of Black women to working class struggle. The NNC prefigured what we today call intersectionality by observing that, quote, the Negro women of America are subjected to threefold exploitation as women, as workers, and as Negroes, and are forced through discrimination into the most menial labor under the worst conditions without organizational protection, end quote. Thus, the NNC was unique, not only because of the breadth of the coalition that came together, but also because the coalition looked to the Black worker to lead the liberation of the race. Previously, it had been middle-class organizations that advocated on behalf of African Americans, and the most illustrious of these were the NAACP and the Urban League. At the NNC, by contrast, each speech and resolution focused on the plight of Black working women and men, their exclusion from the ranks of organized labor, and the urgency of interracial solidarity to meet the continuing deprivation of the Great Depression. Indeed, Jim Crow unionism had created a crisis of unemployment in the Black community. The desegregation of American unions, the NNC reasoned, would open the doors to the formal labor market. Accordingly, they worked closely with the Congress of Industrial Organization, CIO, to organize Black workers in the steel, auto, tobacco, and meatpacking industries. By 1941, just a few short years after their inaugural meeting in Chicago, they had organized almost 200 local unions and approximately 250,000 Black workers. But as I argue in my new book, Freedom Train, Black Politics and the Story of Interracial Labor Solidarity, the campaign to integrate organized labor was not only a massive union drive, for the overarching strategic objective was in fact to defeat fascism. The leaders and rank and file of the NNC, like other independent Black labor organizations that came before it, understood that theirs was a struggle on two fronts: a war against white supremacy in the labor movement at home, and Nazism and imperialism abroad. Some NNC activists even believed that they must open up a third cultural front in which artists and intellectuals marauded for hearts and minds through the theater, dance, literature, painting, and sculpture. If industrial organizing and the arts comprised the war on the home front, then the NNC organized the Negro Labor Victory Committee, or NLVC, to muster the Black masses in support of the war against Germany and Japan. The win the war apparatus of the Congress was led by the most promising young cadres in the movement, people like Uric Guinier of the State, County, and Municipal Workers Union, Vicki Garvin of the United Office and Professional Workers of America, and Ferdinand Smith of the National Maritime Union, all of whom were card-carrying socialists or communists. This is not to say that the Black-led United Front operated without internal division. The story I tell in Freedom Train is not exclusively one of unified collective action, but one fraught with struggle between the centrist and left factions of Black civil society. As the Congress became ever more closely aligned with the communists and the CIO, beginning in 1940, for example, A. Philip Randolph resigned his post as NNC president and established a new mass organization that you may have heard of, the March on Washington movement, or MOVE. A vocal anti-communist, Randolph invented the tactic of the march during the Second World War to put direct pressure on the state to desegregate the defense industries, a growing sector of American capital. Toward the end of the war, the NNC's left faction threatened to dismantle the Congress from within. Because Stalin and the Soviet Union were now allies of the United States and Britain in the ruling world order, the head of the Communist Party USA, Earl Browder, argued that mass organizations were no longer necessary and ordered the NNC to disband. Browder's lieutenant inside the NNC, Communist ILD attorney Ben Davis, who in years prior had defended the Scottsboro Boys, said, quote, "Years ago, it was necessary for us to mobilize masses of people in the streets on every struggle that we had. Today, that is not necessary, except in rare instances. We are working with all forces that are for winning the war." Against these centrifugal pressures, the NNC adapted and innovated. Although the Congress disagreed with what they called Randolph's splitting tactics, they understood that any opposition to the March on Washington would alienate the Black masses. Rather than speak out against Randolph, the NNC joined the struggle to desegregate the defense industries. In a letter to youth organizer Edward Strong, dated May 27, 1941, NNC National Director John P. Davis explained, quote, "Any other course would be bound to lead to our isolating ourselves from the masses of the people. The very fact that the Negro press and a large section of local Negro leadership in a number of communities is actively engaged in support of the idea of a mass march on Washington would make it dangerous for us to attempt to discredit the march. Indeed, we have no desire to discredit militant action of any group sincerely seeking jobs for the Negro people." If the NNC accommodated their right flank, then they did an end run around their left. Instead of copping to the ridiculous notion that Black working class mobilization was no longer necessary, the young cadres of the NNC built a new power base among Black workers in Midwestern cities like Detroit and Chicago, and in doing so weakened their comrades in New York, the original stronghold of the Congress. By the time that the left came to their senses and ousted Browder from party leadership, the mass faction of the NNC, led by national organizer Thelma Dale and Detroiters like LeBron Simmons and Coleman Young, took control of the Congress and directed their cadres to conduct a far-reaching campaign to organize the entire industrial Midwest. This in turn would become the base of the National Negro Labor Council, or NNLC, the preeminent independent Black labor organization of the 1950s, which desegregated retail giants like Sears and Roebuck, transportation companies like American Airlines, and hotel chains like Statler and Hilton. So what lessons does this brief history of the National Negro Congress teach us about our present moment? The first lesson is that we must bring back the mass movement as an organizational form and de-emphasize the lobby and interest group model that has taken over institutional politics in the United States and elsewhere. By mass movement, I am referring to an organization with layers of accountability going down to clubs at the grassroots. The NNC and the March on Washington movement had local councils or committees in every major city, state, and region in America, and even had precinct and workplace committees. Moreover, each council had organizing partners in the labor movement, civil rights organizations, the clergy, the press, fraternities and sororities, and colleges and universities. These were eclectic organizations, but they were organized around a strategic objective: the defeat of fascism at home and abroad, a shared set of tactics, minimum demands upon which all members of the United Front could agree, and a timeline with shared benchmarks of where we want to be in 6 months, 1 year from now, and 5 years from now, and so on. Progressive civil society today is organizationally fractured and diffuse, with no coherent alternative vision for the future. As a labor educator who teaches union members every day, I can say of my own movement that there are unions who are cooperating with the Trump administration, unions that are opposed to Trump, unions that are socialists, unions of pork choppers whose leaders only care about staying in power, and unions that are just trying to stay alive. The second lesson is that we must expect and learn to live with the mess of building truly democratic mass movements. The NNC did not remain unified through the Depression and Second World War, and yet they did not fail even in the face of factional strife. Too often in social movement spaces, we are told that charges of racism, sexism, homophobia, and democratic process are destructive and ultimately disloyal. The struggle for interracial labor solidarity in the middle of the 20th century is a valuable counterexample for our time. It was precisely their ability to navigate the tensions in Black civil society and the wider labor movement that fueled tactical innovation, and the combination of these tactics put ever greater pressure on the state and organized labor to address the problem of the color line. The third lesson is that the United Front was a multi-year, above-ground movement that became the target of state repression. We might as well inoculate ourselves to that fact and settle in for the long haul. The NNC was formed in 1936 and lasted until 1947. Its successor, the National Negro Labor Council, existed from 1951 to 1956. And the high point of the so-called Negro Labor Alliance was the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. If we don't count the period from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to the assassination of Dr. King during the Memphis sanitation workers' strike in 1968, we are talking about a period of 27 years, over a quarter century. During that time, the movement survived the Red Scare, in which the FBI turned some of its leaders into government informants, to say nothing of the violent death throes of Jim Crow with their Dixiecrat citizens' councils in the Klan. 2 organizations were destroyed by FBI infiltration. Even the 1963 March on Washington had FBI informants embedded in the upper echelons of the leadership. And yet no independent Black labor organization from 1921 onward ever went underground. They organized in the full light of day and ran directly into the teeth of the fascist defense by building grassroots power and, when necessary, mobilizing mass protests against political repression itself. We too must plan to build an enduring above-ground movement with the capacity to overcome political repression. Finally, the organizations that we are already a part of need not relinquish their goals, but they must be willing to pin them to the mass movement's overarching strategy. Again, the way that the NNC did this was by framing the struggle against fascism as a war on 2 fronts: in the widening European and Asian military theater, and at home against white supremacy and American unions. This they did with stunning clarity, and we must do the same. This may take the form of transnational struggle, as it did in the 1930s. The Palestine Solidarity Movement, to name one progressive partner, has already been hard at work shining a bright light on police surveillance technologies, institutional investments, and labor exploitation in the United States and around the globe. Now, some may say that we do not have the capacity, resources, or political will to unify and defeat the far right. The Trump administration and the re-emerging axis of fascist powers are certainly formidable, and they are in the ascendant. However, the liberation movements of the past, including the shining example of the Black freedom struggle in the US labor movement, were always financially strapped, if not broke. Yet they faced down enemies that were at least as well resourced as our contemporary foes. I would argue that as murderous as they may be, Trump, Orban, Modi, and the rest are relatively weak copycats of the original version. Nevertheless, our forebears defeated them when seemingly all hope had faded. The other thing that must be said is that we do not have a choice. What is the alternative exactly to fighting fascism? As a Filipino whose family lived under the Marcos dictatorship, I must ask you, are you really prepared to succumb to martial law, neighbors spying upon neighbors, and secret police who come in the dead of the night to throw you behind the sun? We must never let that happen again, as long as we draw breath. We can rebuild a new united front for the 21st century, but we must learn the lessons of the 20th. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cedric. Now we'll hear from Maurice Mitchell.
Yo, he was spitting straight up. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So my name is Maurice Mitchell. I'm currently the National Director of the Working Families Party. I want to thank my colleagues here on the dais. Thank you, Rishi. Thank you all. Thank you, folks. Talk about above ground. We're like in the air. We're on the internet. Before I go any further, I do want to make something clear. The Working Families Party. So I do a lot of electoral politics, and we live in a very rigid two-party system. And so most people assume that's democratic politics. The Working Families Party is an independent third party. We're building from the ground up the infrastructure to engage in independent politics. That often means in this rigid two-party system, recruiting independent voices and running them in Democratic Party primaries opportunistically. Sometimes that means running people as independent Working Families Party folks. But before I say anything further, I wanted to establish that because that would help frame the things that I do and the work that we engage in. I was taking a lot of notes and I was nerding out. And one thing that I wrote is there are no shortcuts in organizing. And I think that there's a tension here because we're in a moment of authoritarian breakthrough. So we feel this urgency appropriately. And also there are no shortcuts. What do we do with that? It's a question. Just want to put that in the air. The other thing that I think most people either saw or saw some pictures of the inauguration, right? Maybe you all decided not to do that because you didn't want to traumatize yourself. But there's a pretty famous picture of that, of the Billionaires Row, where there's Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, and they're all kind of hanging out. And I actually believe that this moment, what makes this moment so pregnant with possibility, is that this is a moment of unmasked oligarchy and white Christian nationalism. And a lot of the lessons that would probably take a lot of sort of abstract theoretical conversations in order to drive home for some folks are so apparent. So like when we want to explain what class solidarity is, we just need to show that picture to people. It's like, these are individuals that do not like each other, are deeply competitive with one another. And they go hard against one another. And they are unified in their class solidarity because they understand that working together against all of us makes so much material sense. And they figured out how to disagree with one another, how to compete with one another, and work together for their common class interest. And so if they can learn that lesson, and if that's clear to them and clear to us, we could see that they have a common class interest. What does that mean for all of us, right? And I think there's so many of those lessons that are just abound, so that I could have conversations with folks on the block every single day about class solidarity, right? About why do politics, when they're doing the flood the zone work that they do, where they have this theory, right? Where let's just go really hard. Let's do our maximalist program. And let's not in any way try to be careful about it. We're just going to have as many executive orders as possible. And basically what they're trying to do is go faster than the courts, go faster than the press could even report on it, go faster than our ability to organize against it, so that they could just kind of like run the table. That's the point. And in so doing, confuse us, right? Like kind of flood us, like even like on a emotional level, just flood our flight or fright sort of centers so that we can't properly organize a strategy against them. And there's some logic to it, but in doing that, they hit everybody, which creates an opportunity for us to build the broadest, most diverse, and largest solidarity movement in our country's history, right? Because you have folks who recently voted for Trump, who are farmers in Missouri, who are going bankrupt because they can't draw down federal funding, right? You have folks who are simply on Medicaid and rely on Medicare, which is everybody, right? So many people who are concerned, as they should be, about whether or not they're going to have those programs. That's an opportunity, right? Many of those people have no politics or any coherent politics at all. Some of those people might lean a little right. Some of those people might be like dedicated leftists, but they all are commonly feeling that anxiety. How are we engaging with them? How are we figuring out, understanding that there are no shortcuts, how to close that gap between us and them and bring them into a front, this united front? That's a question. I think about a woman whose door I knocked in November. It was the days before the election. It was in North Philadelphia. Black woman, she's like 24. We're gonna call her Sharon in order to protect her identity, okay? Knocked on our door. We had a long conversation. She was very generous with her time. And she agreed on all the issues. We endure, even though we're an independent political organization, we reasoned in the binary choice between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump that we had to go hard for Harris. And I got really practiced in laying out the argument for Harris and laying out the issue-based argument from child tax credit to her policy on marijuana to, you name it, right? And she agreed on all those things because the Democratic Party actually does a pretty good job of testing agreement on discrete issues, right? And so they have a range of issues that are like popular based on that metric. And so she's like, yeah, I agree with all those things. But she did not believe in me, nor did she believe in Kamala Harris's ability or true desire to deliver, right? The effort didn't pass the bullshit test, right? And nor, as we talked more, did she believe in her own agency and her own ability to be able to transform her community because her issue was gun violence. And she shared with me how multiple people on her block were no longer on her block because of gun violence, and how people don't cry anymore on her block when they learn that somebody, another community member, another family member is no longer there. That is how emotionally numb they have grown to gun violence. And she was like, look, you're the first person that has knocked on my door. Where are the politicians? Where are the local politicians? And at the end, she was like, if I vote, and I don't know if she voted, but if I do vote, I'll probably vote for that lady. But I'm not convinced that anything will change. And, you know, I struggled with her around that, but honestly, in my heart of hearts, I'm not convinced that anything would change for her and her community. And to me, when I think about the November election, and the crazy thing is, it was a close election, right? Don't let Trump and the right gaslight us, right? It was actually very close. It shouldn't have been close. Like, given who we were arguing against, in a rational world, it shouldn't have been close. And it should frighten us, the fact that it was close. But in that close election, when I go back and I think about all the things that we did, I can't honestly say, that if the Working Families Party or if any of the organizations that are involved in that, if we had just more money or, we got more canvassers out in the field or, there was more digital ads, that would have made the difference. Ultimately, I think about Sharon and I think about her condition and I think about the fact that she feels subject to all of these decisions and does not feel like an agent. And if we're to build this front, the question of whether or not people like her, people like Sharon, working class people all across this country, see our movement as some sort of outside agent, or see our movement as a natural expression of their community and their urges and their desires and their prerogatives, to me, that question is the fundamental question about whether or not we will actually succeed in this historic moment in building that large, diverse, broad, and deep front. To me, that is the heart of the question. So I sit with that pretty often, and it continues to rattle in my heart and in my mind. So what do we do with all this? I have more questions than I have answers. One thing that I'm clear on is that everybody needs their assignment, and that's actually part of the work, right? Because you could get to the place where you've made the argument, and like I said before, it's easier and easier to make the argument to more and more people. For some people, the argument has already been made by their condition, by the fact that they were a federal worker and they no longer have a job, or the fact that they no longer have benefits that they once had, or the fact that a family member or themselves are now in risk of being disappeared, right? Like, the argument does not necessarily have to be made to people because they're feeling it. So you get to the point where you've made the argument, and then people say, okay, now what? That is our job as organizers. We have to offer people their assignments, and assignments that are understandable, that are culturally relevant, and that are ultimately that are ultimately strategic, right? Because we don't want to give people make work, right? It is our duty to give people meaningful work in this struggle that relates to where they are, in race, class, and gender, in geography, relates to where they are in terms of what they have to offer and what they can offer. That's our work as organizers. That is not other people's work. That is the organizers' work. And we have to think really critical as mass organizers in this moment. How do we make that popular invitation? And how do we make it irresistible, right? And that's something that I think we need to struggle around. You mentioned culture. I believe that culture is one of the ways that we can make that popular invitation and we can make it irresistible. And we have to really lean on all of our culture workers, all of our cultural organizers, and lift them up and sort of get over that tendency of looking at cultural organizing and cultural work as a nice to have, right? In a moment when the right wing is engaged in a multi-dimensional cultural affront against working people, right? And this comes from somebody who counts votes and focuses on how many canvassers per door and all those other things, right? It's a both and. Those things are still, they marginally have a role, but we have to bring all those things together. I have not read a thing on here because you all have inspired me so much, and I'm like, oh, I want to respond to that. The other question is, what do we do with the Democratic Party, right? And we need to answer this question seriously, because if we're building a united front, if we're building a Cheney to Chomsky united front, they're a part of it. They're a part of it. And I'm somebody who's building an independent political party outside of them. How do we relate to them? And here's the thing. If we're serious, that means we are signing up to participate in a coalition politics that includes people that we disagree with. It includes people that we disagree with on the right, who might have voted for Trump for all types of reasons, but are having buyer's remorse. Our most direct right, people inside the sort of corporate Democratic Party who there are tactical reasons for us to align with. To our left, to our farthest left, we actually need to figure out how to be in that uncomfortable space of engaging. And to me, that means getting really good at principle struggle, getting really good at building real relationships with people and serious relationships with people where we could really work with them and do it in a way that's principled, where we could work with them while we disagree with them. And we don't in any way mask that disagreement, right? We have to figure out how that happens. And we also need to recognize that in joining the front, there are no guarantees, right? It's like, well, how do you join the front? We were talking about this before. How do you join the front or build a front that includes all of these different factions, including factions that you disagree with, in a way where you don't dilute your politics, or they don't take advantage of you, or they don't co-opt you? And the reality is there are no guarantees. They are likely to attempt to do those things. They're likely, maybe a likely scenario is that they succeed. And we still have to engage in that struggle. And the ultimate sort of question about whether or not other factions succeed in diluting or co-opting or whatever is our organizing. So it's it's not a question of them. It's a question of what we're willing to do. At the Working Families Party, I'm like, look, the Democrats are going to do what they're going to do. And based on that, they're doing it well. They're doing what they were intending to do well. That's, from my standpoint, a problem, right? But there's no version of reality where they're going to stop doing that, where they're going to stop being captured by capital, where they're going to stop engaging in, sort of vapid representative politics and all of that stuff. That's what they do. They've never actually, in any serious way, suggested that they would do otherwise. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? To me, that is the question at hand. And that's to me, the maybe hard question we have to ask about how much power do we actually have? How much power do we need? What are we actually bringing to a coalition? So I want us to understand that there's no version of reality where Chuck Schumer is going to be the spear of the revolution, right? Right, and then then there's not much to say about Chuck Schumer, right? Great, he is out playing the role that Chuck Schumer has consistently played, what is our mandate, right? A few other things with the balance of my time is one of the things that we're curious about and is how can we on the local level unleash the dynamism of working class people. And so one of the things that we're doing is like we are recruiting at this point 1,000 working class candidates all across the country. If you are here and you've ever been curious about running, you should. But don't run for Congress, like run for water board or school board or city council or fire district. We need people to govern on the hyper local level, and we'll support you and make sure that that happens. Some people should run for Congress, but not everybody, right? And we'd like to accompany you in doing that because what we need to do is to get in the habit of governing, right? The last thing I'll say is that the reason why I think that that's important and why I do party organizing is that political parties, small parties, large parties, third parties, they wake up every morning, they put their pants on and they go out and they attempt to govern the entire country, right? And that's a pretty bold thing and it disciplines you. And what we need is a disciplined force that understands that our job, the other thing that political parties do is like they attempt to win elections. And when you attempt to win an election, you understand implicitly that you have to win over people that don't agree with you, right? That is how you win an election. And so how do we win over people who today are not with us yesterday? How do we do that? What are the conversations we need to have? What is the appeal we need to master? And then what is like the organizing, which, you know, my training is like 80% listening, 20% talking. What is the organizing we need to do so that we can bear witness to the complexities that are happening with the working class, right? Which means it's not enough to be right, although we are, which is great. It's better, I think, to be right? And it's not enough to be factually correct. I think we've learned that from them. They're neither right nor factually correct, but they're empowered, right? And so we can't smugly be happy with the fact that we're factually correct and right? It's great to have those as tools, but ultimately we have to also build a movement, have more people today than we had yesterday, so that we could overwhelm them, right? Fascists only understand the fight, and we need to bring it to them.
Can we give one more round of applause for all these amazing panelists? What I want to do now is I have a couple of questions that I want to pose to you all, but I also want to make it possible for you all to pose questions to each other. So I'll ask one question just to get us started, but think about what you may want to ask each other, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A in a little bit. All of you gave really powerful comments on both the sort of opportunities that we're confronted with, the immense threats that we're encountering, and the big limitations that our movements are confronting in being able to sort of rise to the occasion, right? So, you know, we've sort of named that if we're going to build a broad front, we're going to be in not just coalition with people that we don't agree with, but in some cases, partners that are much more powerful than us, right? We have to address the fact that our movements have an organized social base, it's not nearly big enough, and we certainly don't have something that rises to the level of mass movements that Cedric has named. So what I want to ask is, if we all agree, and it seems we all do up here, that the sort of need to build a broad front is imperative, amongst other things, what power do we bring to that front, to sort of pick up on Maurice's question? Right? What power do we bring to that front? How would we operate in a space where there are so many diverse kinds of actors when we bring whatever it is we bring? Anybody feel up for that question? I'm looking. Go ahead if you're ready.
Oh,
yeah, please.
I think that we bring the power of our respective constituencies and bases, right? I mean, however, look, so here's I need to step back a little bit, okay? Because the overarching, if the overarching strategic objective of the 1930s left was to defeat fascism, the overarching strategic sort of focus and approach of the organized left for much of the post-war period has been to align with the Democratic Party, right, in hopes that through that institutional relationships, we can bring home the bacon to our own constituencies. And that has not worked. It is an abject failure. And so we sit at a moment now where the Democratic Party may have relationships in what we might call civil society among the rank and file, but that relationship is thin. The organizations that we are a part of on the ground, those relationships are not thin. People come to our meetings, okay? They sit through these interminable, conversations about, what we're going to do about this struggle or this company that's coming in or this polluter or what have you. And so I think that what we bring is we bring a mass base. That's not nothing. And it's not a base actually that the Democratic Party holds. They do not have the allegiance of the people, okay? And so I think that's something that we can work with. But again, because one of the limitations, right, is that all of our respective organizations who are doing amazing work in local struggles, many of us are fractured or where it's diffused, it's super decentralized, right? We're not all we're not on the same timeline. We're not pursuing the same benchmarks. And so I think that there needs to, this is why I said that the first step is really to resuscitate this idea of a mass movement again, right? And get away from some of the advocacy politics that has been so popular in the contemporary scene. But in order to do that, we need to just be aware about what we bring to the table, which is the power of the base.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I 100% agree in terms of moving away from the advocacy politic and kind of the orientation of accessing power through relationships and inside game or just focusing on policy. There's a role for the advocacy work, but in this moment, it's not consistent. And in some ways, we've lost our edge in terms of scaling our power and also thinking about how we escalate the forms of how we're exercising power. I agree that we bring our constituencies in base, and I feel also we've got to be real that we've got to build way more people power, and we got to do it quickly. And so part of that, I think, is disrupting the 2-year electoral legislative cycle that keeps us in reactive mode. To Maurice's point, right, there are no shortcuts, and yet there is incredible urgency. And so we have to act quickly. But we also, it's going to take as long as it takes, and we've got to get real about how we scale power and get back to the organizing and then also innovate. I think we also bring just more movement infrastructure again than in the past, right? We have organizations, we have relationships, the state power caucus folks that are here, we've got statewide civic engagement infrastructure, we have alliances, we have relationships, we have long-term agendas, we have skills in terms of fighting fights and electing candidates and turning out voters. We've been working on building narrative power, right? Understanding how we communicate and disseminate narratives, right? That are going to make meaning and win over hearts and minds. And then I think we also have intergenerational, multiracial wisdom, expertise, and skill. The elders teach us about history and keep us grounded. And the young folks that now call me an OG, which was hard to accept. They hold our feet to the fire in terms of also stop being boring. We gotta have joy. They don't Zoom meetings with PowerPoint. Forget your little Excel spreadsheet. I'm gonna dazzle you with my Canva that's way better, right? So I think there's a lot of power and energy there in terms of the intergenerational nature of our movement.
Just to add, I think two things, right? There is a tremendous amount of power in thinking that one does not have power, right? So yes, there's political power in terms of the elected officials and in terms of the amount of funding that they have, right? And how they can sway policy, how they can sway the courts, how they can rip people off the streets, right? Yes, that is a tremendous amount of power, but it's a very specific kind of power, right? And the power that organizers bring, the power that regular everyday people bring is a lot more. It's just we oftentimes forget that we have it, right? And because, right, that power operates in very different ways, it means that the risks are oftentimes not as magnified, right? When you have a group of folks who are so extremely oppressed, then that means like, well, fuck it. We can then do a whole lot of other creative things to then fight against this, right? We don't have to work inside of these systems by these rules because that's clearly not working for us. So how do we get creative in doing that? So that's the first thing, right? There is a tremendous amount of power in thinking one does not have power, right? And so how do we tap into that? And then the other thing, and this goes back to a little bit of what has been said earlier, right? There's a tremendous amount of power in local knowledge, local epistemologies, understanding of local issues, how to solve those local issues, and getting people at the table, right? So honoring that is a really great way of telling folks like we do respect you and want to listen to you, and we don't need to tell you, right, how to solve these things because we know you all already know how to do that. It's just about building community so that we can address those issues. I'm so glad that you said that we just have to give people their homework, because I talk to so many people who are like, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. And I just need some guidelines, somebody to help me figure this out, because all I keep hearing is calling my senator, and I'm doing that, but it doesn't feel like enough. And I just need to know what else to do. So there's folks who are ready and willing to do that, but just need, right, those guidelines and those steps moving forward.
You know, every day we have a test of this, or every week, or sometimes it feels like every hour. You know, while we were here, and one of the things that's been distracting is the fact that Newark Mayor Ross Baraka was arrested by the Trump regime. You know, and we recently endorsed him for governor of New Jersey. And so this is a current test that is in real time. How do we respond to this? And to me, this is one of those actions that actually it breaks the threshold of the reasonableness test, right? Where most people, you don't have to be a leftist, most people would probably be like, it seems unreasonable that the federal government has arrested the mayor of a major city. Like, what's going on there? That's an opportunity for us to be in dialogue with millions of people who a few hours ago, before they decided to arrest Ross Baraka, we wouldn't have that opportunity. And so we need to get, and they'll give us many opportunities because they're fascist.
Yeah.
So we need to get really good in rapidly pivoting to our most popular and accessible version of ourselves when these moments happen, so that we can bring more people in.
Thank you. Do any of you have a question that you want to ask to one another? Yet? Still percolating?
Yeah, I have a question. So my question is to our two esteemed delegates from academia.
Boy.
Yep. My question is, so, you know, one way I think about this moment is that we are in a moment where authoritarians have taken over our country, right? And what's hard about that is that fascism feels like going to the park and, you know, drinking coffee at the cafe that you had coffee at last year and doing all types of pedestrian things for a lot of people until it doesn't. And, you know, part of our job is enrolling people in the fight before it's too late. And maybe last year, there were people in academia and there were people in major universities, whatever, who did not think that they were part of some sort of like anti-fascist movement. But when the government is attempting to take down, and I probably didn't think of them as being part of any movement that I was a part of, but when the government's trying to take down Harvard University and is disappearing academics for their speech against apartheid and genocide. How does that change your role in this moment? Or how do you think about your role in this moment? Or maybe what is the proper role of academics in this moment?
You wanna go first?
Yeah, right. That is a great question, and it's a question I've been wrestling with. Full disclosure, I've told Rishi this already. Like I was, I don't know when I got the email, February, March, whenever it was, just depressed in my office because I'm like, I don't know how to wrap my head around this moment, right? I don't know. I'm a comparative race scholar, right? I have an NSF career that was recommended that's being held up. Who the hell knows what's going to happen because of the kind of work that I do. I talk about white supremacy. I talk about, right, the genocide in Palestine in my class. I talk about how race and gender are entwined into all of US social policy in all of my classes, right? So I'm just sitting in my office depressed and like, what the fuck am I, like, what am I doing? How do I show up in this moment? And I'm also like, I grew up in the hood. So there's a part of me who's also just like, this just feels like I'm being bullied and I don't like that, right? And then I get Rishi's email. And I was like, you know what? Even though, because a lot of academics are really siloed, right? And a lot of folks are afraid and we're watching what's happening around us. And so people really aren't talking about things. So I get this email and I'm like, all right, there's other folks who are still committed to doing the work, right? And understanding what this might be moving forward and contributing in the ways that they can contribute. So I don't have children, right? I don't have anybody depending on me. I am not married. I have 3 cats and that's about it, right? In my house. So if that means that I start becoming more vocal in this moment, then I've already talked to my family about this, and that means I start becoming more vocal in this moment. But that goes back to what I said, like some people are going to be more comfortable doing that than others for a variety of reasons, right? And we have to all be okay with that. So in terms of, I can't speak to the role of the academic, right? But I can speak to the role of me, and what that has meant in this moment is continuing to talk to my students about all of these things, right? To look at the executive orders, to put them into historical context, right? To provide some of that public education, to have conversations with non-academic. I don't really hang out with a lot of academics outside of work. So to have those conversations outside of these spaces, to make sure I'm staying on top of things. And then to also consider like where my comfort points are at and where they're not. That is easier to do when you know that you're in community, right? It is easier to take those risks when you know, okay, I'm in community. And even if those risks might be very serious and very dire, I know that I'm doing it with others, right? And so I think that's the most important thing in thinking through some of this stuff. The other thing, and this goes back to something that Sabrina said, I'm sorry, I'm horrible at names, Sabrina. Yes, thank you. That Sabrina's, I have memory issues, it's a whole thing. A lot of my work focuses on the importance of collective play and joy for adult Black and brown folks in public parks. So when you said going to the park, like fascism feels like going to the park until you can't, well, Black and brown folks have never been able to go to the park in peace, right? And just been joyful. And so part of that too is also centering the importance of laughter and love and joy in this moment and not letting that go to the wayside, right? Because it is just as serious as everything else. And if we can't, if we're not allowed to experience those things, then our humanity is also being chipped away at in multiple ways. So I would say those two.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, so it's interesting. Professional sociology. One would think, or maybe you don't, but one might think that they would be down for the cause. but they're absolutely not down for the cause. And I was on the governing council of the American Sociological Association for 3 years prior, like during October 7th and so forth. And it was like pulling teeth to try and get these professional sociologists to have the courage to speak up, call for and agree to divest their limited investments from the war machine. And their fear was that if they got in the game, then they would draw attention to themselves and turn themselves into a target of the far right. Fact of the matter is that we were already a target of the far right.
Yep.
And being quiet has never been a winning strategy to defeat fascism. The only way to defeat fascism, right, as Mo mentioned, is to fight, right? And so what does that mean? For me as an academic, as a professional sociologist, it means for me that I need to not really be interested in the kind of professional metrics of what makes value for me that increases my stature in the profession. Like, I mean, this is not, we're talking about, if just speaking about Gaza alone, we're talking about 40,000 people dead. Right? So what are we really talking about the sort of long-term viability of a fucking professional association? This is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. And so what do I think about my role? I see my role as I don't want to big up myself too much by calling myself an intellectual of the labor movement. I guess I am by sort of conventional categories, but I prefer to see myself as an educator, because I make a much bigger impact teaching people how to organize, teaching people about labor history and so forth, and about what unions are, for example, and what the working class is, for example, than publishing an article, which might eventually be read by, if you're lucky, 200 people, right? I mean, I've taught thousands and thousands of people in my life, and I teach the required course in organizing in the labor studies program at UMass Amherst. And what I do all day is I help rank and file workers think through what it means to organize, what that looks like. I put them out in the field so that they're actually organizing real workers, right? Instead of just talking about organizing. And so I see my role as really kind of building capacity for mass movements. And I just think, I mean, I have no choice. What else would I be doing with my time? I mean, it would just the idea of holding myself in like my office and writing a journal article for the American Journal of Sociology just seems to me obscene. Obscene. When our sister Ozturk is abducted in the full light of day in Medford, Massachusetts, when she's leaving her house and then thrown into a prison in Louisiana. Why the fuck am I writing a journal article? Right? Actually, I'm not. I'm doing other things. And so that's my answer to your question. I hope that's clear enough.
Thank you both.
Thank you. That's perfect. Well, despite what Cedric says about his publishing, make sure to buy his book. Highly impactful. So I want to take a little time to take a question or two from the audience before we wrap up. Who has a question they want to ask?
Or comments?
Or comments? Oh, you did? Can you read it? Yeah.
How do we build majoritarian united front that includes organizations and individuals who are anchored in a base building organization.
Well, a majoritarian united front of organizations and individuals who are anchored in a base building organization, right? Is that good? I don't know. Okay. So I think we have a lot of practice, and we're practicing two different things. We're practicing our ability to remain in coalition with one another. And that requires a lot of repetition of creating the vehicles and doing the coalition organizing so people could come together, and we're humans at the end of the day, so that we could be human with one another. That really matters. That we could talk and build strategy with one another. That strategy is a deep and broad and long strategy, so that it's not just tactical. I think that that's really critical. And you can't skip the strategic stuff. I think in order for that to happen, I think like coalitions that are built on thin solidarity, because like the idea is that like if you get a bunch of things together, it's like 1 + 1 + 1 will equal 3, right? And I think that that's fine, but when it's been built on thin solidarity, it's like 1 + 1 + 1 equals like 1.5, right? Because like, people come to the coalition table, but for all types of reasons. Sometimes you just go there to lurk, or you go there because, somebody that an adversary is there. You don't want them to be there. You want to be there too. And then when it comes time to actually show up for the intended purpose of the coalition, you get like half a measure. And all of that work of coming together and meeting and being in conversations is it's not only for naught, it's like net negative. It's like we could have been doing other things. What we actually need to do is more than arithmetic. It's actually like an equation where the sum of the parts is actually equal to much, much more than the sum, right? And the way that you do that is on the front end, you have to have real conversations about what are all the things that will, we're adults, we've done this before. What are the things that will almost definitely lead to our failure? Let's name them up front, and then let's figure out how up front we solve for those things. Well, we're likely to fall on our asses around race or around class. We're likely to fall on our asses around the hyper competitive nature that we sometimes hold with one another. Okay, how do we solve for those things? And let's like struggle with one another. And then with the strategy, like, what are we actually, are we just running into a burning building? What are we actually doing with one another? And let's make sure that there are some clear and deeply felt sort of points of unity that are strong points of unity. So that is all of the coalition work. But then that's the sort of lateral work of building the strong solidarity. The ultimate work that you also have to do is build the base, right? Because if we're just in, if there's a bunch of political directors and, other folks in rooms together, building that strong solidarity, but then when you go out and let's bring our contingents together and it's 36 people, then, what was the point? And so we have to practice the strong solidarity. So we actually have an equation that leads to more than the sum of our parts, while we're constantly challenging one another. If we want good competition, I think there's healthy competition. Who's going to build the biggest base? Who is facing working class people again and again and again, right? And like when you're coming back to the coalition table, we're holding each other accountable to how's your base building? I want real numbers. What is your base building looking like, right? So to me, that is the how we do that. It's very, very hard. But to me, it's getting both the strong solidarity work together so that we're acting principally and we're taking risks together. And then also we're holding each other accountable to the base work that we all have to do.
Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I agree. Manuel has challenged us to do solidarity, not agreement.
Mm,
So think about how we engage in that principled struggle, how we don't just show up and agree with each other. And I also think that like good democratic process is critical, right? In terms of how we are transparent with how decisions are made, criteria, who makes decisions, and then we think about the process as a process of democracy, right? As opposed to wasting folks' time in lots of meetings. I think actually WFP California has a model in terms of being both a coalition of organizations as well as a membership base. And I think it's complicated in terms of like, again, aligning at all of those levels. For us in California and California Calls, our model also has been about building bottom-up power and a bottom-up alliance. And so having decision-making of local communities, having the organizing of at the local level be kind of where the energy and the heart is, and then the choices we make around the statewide fights are intended to unlock power, resources, and leverage for local communities to be able to fight for bigger, bolder change at the local level.
Next step.
Yeah, so I think you know, my experience is that we're not going to get anybody mobilized unless there's a fight. Okay. And you know, we can talk about, okay, what's the fight at the local level? What's the kind of like broader fight that we are a part of? But we need, I think we need to engage in concrete struggle, right? So I'm thinking about this, the example of Community Labor United, which is a kind of community labor group operating in Boston and elsewhere. And what they have done is they basically go to local communities and they organize these sort of like town hall conversations in which people dream about what kind of community they want to be. They benchmark it, they timeline it, and then they make a plan and organize around achieving those particular goals to transform their communities into the communities that they want them to be. We can do it. I mean, that's just, you know, one kind of model, but that needs to be scalable, right? So we need to be doing that everywhere. These local concrete struggles where we know where we want to go, right? The other thing that I think is really important in building that kind of united front organization, right, is we need to be pretty clear on tactics, okay? So, for example, from 1936 to 1941, the National Negro Congress is all about industrial organizing. They believe that the way to desegregate the labor movement is to organize Black workers into industrial unions, right? We're not going to get there by trying to plead with white labor leaders to let Black people in, please. That's not going to work. Going into a back room is not going to work. Organizing tens of thousands of workers and saying, well, you want these members or not? is the way that, you know, that they did it. By the way, A. Philip Randolph did not necessarily, after a certain amount of time, he believed that that industrial organizing had sort of like hit a brick wall, and the state wasn't responding, and you know, conservative white leaders labor leaders had kind of dug their heels in and wanted to maintain a certain level of racial segregation in the labor movement. So what did Randolph do? He said, you know what we need to do now? We need to do direct action against the state. Because the state, if we pressure the state will impose discipline upon organized labor and industry and thereby desegregate, you know, the formal labor market. Okay, so those were the decisions that were made, but there were decisions that were made, right? That's a conversation. So what are we doing about these local struggles, right? Are we marching? Are we trying to create the conditions for a broad general strike? Are we organized? I mean, what is it that we're doing? And it doesn't have to be the one tactic, right? But I think that we need to have a conversation about the tactical repertoire that we're willing to engage in and have a playbook so that everybody knows how to do those tactics, right? So local concrete struggle and some decisions about tactics, I think, are really important.
I'll add one thing,
Yeah.
very briefly. So the other thing to keep in mind is thinking about co-optation, many of these tactics have been co-opted, right? And this is what has led to the disenfranchisement of a base because, you know, there's charrettes and visioning and let's dream about our community and for new development, and then gentrification comes in, everybody gets displaced. We want to have, you know, quality, you know, paid jobs, quality education. And we've been saying this for the last 20 years and nothing has changed, right? So it's also recognizing what strategies have been co-opted. How are we clear? Like, yes, we need to dream. If you all have not read Ruha Benjamin's book, Imagination and Manifesto, I highly recommend it, right? Because she talks through the importance of the imagination and dreaming and transforming and coming up with a future that is equitable for everybody. So how do we do that in a way that's also very direct? I'm an ethnographer. I tell folks directly, I'm a community-based scholar, right? I'm working with you on stuff, nothing may change, right? Your conditions, Sharon's conditions may stay the same.
Yeah.
So how do we work on this? Recognizing that Sharon's conditions may not change, but Sharon's grandchild, right, in 30 years, the struggles we're doing today, the strategies we're implementing today may have an impact then, right? And then how do we organize in that way?
Lots there. We are going to turn to Manuel Pastor for some closing comments and then try to wrap up with some synthetic thoughts. But I just want to offer another huge thank you to the panelists. Thank you again.
So I think I'm down to do this partly because it's a Turpanjian chair that I will pay for your blank light.
Thank you.
Yes, I too organized in the 1900s. Back before there were fax machines. I still have a proud Indian craft from knowledge that was about joining the boycott against Gallo, and you can either call Manuel or, if you know him, Kent Wong.
No way.
Because we were on the same dorm floor together, organizing for the UMW. So this means I'm old. But let's say one thing I really liked about this gathering is that the look was into the mirror about what are we doing wrong, not just pointing at the threats that are out there. I shared with some folks the other day that my biggest achievement in this last year was improving my relationship with my daughter. And it wasn't because she changed, it was because I changed. I stopped being judgmental, started listening a little bit more. And you know what? Now she's taking my advice. And maybe that's a lesson for us about hearing the pain that's out there, listening harder. So I want to lift up a couple of things. First, I want to push back on two things Cedric said. One was about journal articles for the graduate students in the room. Still like
Oops.
so that you can then mouth off like Cedric. So, but the other, like, I think you said it, and I think you agree with notification. And it's not just about bringing home the bacon. It's about bringing home the meaning. Because people want more than just plain material. That's right. They want meaning in their lives. The woman that you were talking to is feeling like there's not a lot of meaning in her life. And even we too often think about organizing as instrumental rather than fundamental, as the way to achieve a policy goal rather than the way to transform people
Yeah.
to come into their power. And I think when we do that, we're also gonna take class more seriously, not just as an economic category, but as culture. I've been saying recently that I think the progressive message, there's enough wealth to go around, doesn't resonate as much with working class people as the message, there's enough work to go around. There's enough ways to contribute, there's enough ways to earn, there's enough ways to own. And those ways are being foreclosed by this billionaires group. But I think if we think about meaning and culture, it's important. Second thing I'm taking away is about this participating in the United Front. And I think it was lifted up by a couple of you, I think more by you, I think the most specifically. And that there's a difference between working and believing. There's a difference between joining the Democratic broad front and saying, I hope I can trick these people into my left agenda versus democracy is at stake. I really value this unexpected ally. And I really believe in what we can do together. Third thing, and I'll close with a story, and unfortunately a few of you have heard before, so try to act like it's brand new and interesting. That there's something Teresa said, which is really important too, which is that I and my associate director, co-director of the Equity Research Institute, put out an op-ed this week in the LA Times about the threats to immigrants and talking about this as the first steps to a certain, and partly it's because we're pissed off and we want to write this thing. But partly when we decided to do it a week ago, we said, we need to be the ones who draw the fire. We need to make sure the target is us. Because we're both full professors. We run a research center that's got a fair amount of soft money, too soft, from foundations. But we're well positioned to draw the fire. And I think trying to figure out when we can take advantage of our respective privileges to draw the fire to us is critical. And with that, I'll close with my fire story. You may have heard there was an incident in Los Angeles at the beginning of the year. And my wife and I live in Pasadena, so we were south of it, but we own a rental property in North Pasadena adjoining Altadena that we bought so that my daughter, who is embarking on a high earning career as a social worker, could have a place to live. And she evacuated the night before the fires really took off, woke me up on the morning saying, I'm looking at my Ring camera because she's from the 21st century. And I can see that down the street, some houses are on fire. Just as that happened, the front tenant came to this house. Because, believe it or not, his wife had said, I know there's a fire, but I think you should put the trash cans out just in case they're collecting. So he showed up and sent me a phone call and a video, or I called him, and there's a fire down the street, and then, oh my God, the backyard's on fire. And he and his father-in-law, Arturo, who 3 hours earlier had lost his home, rushed to the backyard with buckets of water. And neighbors broke through one fence and then just marched to the other fences, which had burned up, to work on putting out the fire in our backyard. About half an hour later, my wife showed up. About 45 minutes later, I showed up. We were in different locations, had to sneak in under police tape and join the group of neighbors who began moving from house to house, putting out fires in the backyard, a few fires in the houses where 4 houses up from us, the firefighters were staging a last stand to try to prevent more of it from coming into the neighborhood. About half the houses on our neighborhood burned up. Our front 2 units survived. Backyard burned up. 3 melted cars. What a sight. Burned fences, etc. And I take from that 3 lessons, which I think are apropos. First, sometimes when there's a fire, you just have to rush to it. And we've got a national fire of fascism, and if we're able, we should be rushing to it. Second, it's better if you go there with your friends and neighbors. It's foolhardy to rush to it alone, but collectively, we might be able to do something. But the third, and actually also crucial lesson, is we never would have made it without those firefighters, without the government, without the state. Funny little story, at one point, one of the firefighters wandered down in my direction while I was still closing out something. I said, you know, we could actually use you here because it seems like it's coming back up. He said, I think you have it together, and walked away. Fucking firefighter. But too often we romanticize our courage rushing to the fire, or romanticize mutual aid as being sufficient, when what we need to do is to seize the state and make sure it's not throwing gasoline on the fire. Make sure instead it's fighting the fire so our communities can thrive. And with that, to close us out, Dr. Kim Tabari.
Keep it up, keep it up. All right, I just want to say a big thank you to our wonderful panelists and to the audience for your deep engagement, both in person and online. Special thanks to the event planning folks, ERI, Lauren, Paris, Deborah, other ERI staff here today. And thank you to the Turpanjian Family Educational Foundation for their generous support and vision to endow the Civil Society and Social Change Chair and today's event. Our next event is the 2026, right? 2026 State of Immigrant Integration, 2025? 2025 State of Immigrant Integration in LA sometime in October. So please follow our socials for that. We also have community engaged research grants for postdoc folks, USC grad students, faculty, et cetera, folks that are on campus. So everyone, please stay safe, stay healthy, and engage beyond the chaos as we continue our collective and individual work to uplift our communities, California, and the nation. Thank you and hope to see you soon.